Everybody, hopefully it's all working well. I'm going to start doing some lives. Going to be able to talk to you a little bit more significantly about things like PTSD, EMDR, some of my specialties. If you haven't been to this channel before and you're just finding it through searching through PTSD and EMDR, Dr. Trevor Wilkins. I'm known as the Angry Viking Therapist here on social media. And I specialize in things like EMDR, rational motor behavior therapy, especially with treating things like PTSD, adults with childhood trauma, and all the things that come with it. So um, I want to be able to speak more significantly, as I said before, about some of these subjects and allow some people to do some Q and A's. If if some people come in while the live is going on, hopefully I'll leave this up. If not, and people can shoot me some questions. And I want to start out by showing you a study that's been done recently for something that is very important to me when we talk about EMDR, and that is shame. When you're a new EMDR therapist, as I was years ago, um, it was apparent that what you thought you were going to see the most of was single incident traumas. Somebody came in and perhaps they had been in a car wreck a significant time ago or recently, and now they're afraid to get in a car. Things like 9/11, things like assaults, whether it be as an adult or as a child, things that specific things that might be seen within the public safety community or military community, two of the communities that I work with the most. And when you get out of training and when you start doing EMDR, like many other professions, you're kind of finding your own way. You're trying to find exactly how is this going to work? Is this going to work? Did I waste my time on this? I certainly did not. But what you'll find very early in doing EMDR treatment is that you're not getting a lot of single episode trauma victims. You're not getting a lot of that. In fact, to this day, it's probably 5% of what I see. What I see the most of is significant amounts of trauma that can be identified in the ways that you would think of traumatic things, but also significant amount of trauma that may not be what we would consider big T trauma, the things that maybe people don't think about, divorces and neglect as a child and never feeling loved, feeling helpless, feeling hopeless, feeling not good enough, which is often three of the indicators that we see when it comes to traumatic stress. So as you get out and start working on your own, and any EMDR that may watch this or follow this may be able to testify to this as well, you start seeing a lot of complex cases, a lot of cases where maybe that strict adherence to the protocol, strict adherence to just doing one trauma at a time may not be as profitable for your client as it can be. One of those ways that I started to see that was shame, one of the things we're going to talk about for a few minutes here. And it's not something that you see addressed a lot early in EMDR training. And some of that is not a knock on EMDR training. It's one of the best modalities and the best training components that you can find. It'll change the way that you look at trauma and change the way you look at some of your clients and conceptualize what they're going through. But one of the things we don't talk a lot about is that shame and guilt, because often it's seen as a secondary emotion. Most people may not come in and say, I feel shame and that's what's bringing me down the most. They may actually be depressed or anxious or angry or guilty or dealing with trauma or flashbacks or nightmares, or things that a lot of people may think about more significantly when it comes to EMDR or PTSD rather. So when I was seeing a lot of adults with childhood trauma, and we were having to go way back and deal with some things that maybe the memory wasn't as significant or as clear, or maybe they don't understand how it's causing them problems with them now, but they know they had a rough childhood. I was having trouble getting those clients to kind of take that left turn or see that light bulb moment of dealing with these traumatic events. Individually, one by one, we were dealing with some of these kind of nodes of trauma, but something just seemed to be stuck. They weren't getting, it wasn't getting the same result, the same hopes that I'd wanted out of it. So um, back then, admittedly, I kind of reached out to my mentor, who I think is probably one of the best trauma therapists in the world. Unfortunately, he passed away about a year and a half ago. Dr. E.C. Hurley was trained specifically by the creator of EMDR. I've learned tons from him and continue to through his readings and some of the recordings I have of him and some of the things he sent me. But I reached out and I'm like, I'm not getting some of these adults with childhood trauma to kind of turn the corner. And so I took another advanced class from him. And what I learned almost immediately in that class was Adults with childhood trauma will typically have this umbrella of shame and guilt. And until you get through this umbrella of shame and guilt, you're not getting to the specific traumas or these nodes of what the problems may be underneath. And the problem with that, as I said before, that shame is often seen as kind of a secondary emotion. It may not be taught that way, it may not always be identified that way, but often we end up kind of focusing on the trauma itself and what it caused, not necessarily the shame that the person's feeling. And the thing about shame and guilt is, as you'll see, is that early on in life, if you're dealing with things that you probably had no control over, whether you were the victim, whether it was a family member, so you trusted them at first, is that shame's going to come around. And some of us would like to say, like, you shouldn't have shame about those things because you had no control over them, when in reality, you don't feel that way. Anybody that's dealt with early life trauma, especially before the age of 18 or 20 or young adult, when you're kind of getting out and kind of figuring out who you are, when you're relying upon the people that may have been the ones that hurt you, it's really confusing. So I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. I want to tell you about a study really quick that I found, and this is what I'm going to do on a more regular basis on these lives, is kind of give you some details, some kind of in the weeds, if it were, trying to look at how we know that EMDR is effective in these areas, and not just on single incident PTSD. Again, is what it's great for. It's amazing for that. It's also great for other things. So this is a study called Eye Movement Desensitization Reprocessing, Treatment of Internalized Shame. I'm not going to read it all to you, but I want to read a couple of points to you. 13 subjects were administered the internalized shame scale. So a scale is a type of inventory that we might give to measure where that shame is. Before and after EMDR therapy to determine whether EMDR significantly reduced internalized shame and increased self-esteem as measured by this scale, this ISS. In fact, statistical analysis, so what we do when we do peer-reviewed journals, some of the numbers, and some of you may remember statistics or how to study some of those things from earlier in education, earlier in life. If not, that's okay. I'm not going to throw a bunch of numbers at you. I want to actually show you what this says. But statistical analysis indicated a significant decrease, so a decrease in internalized shame subscale scores. So internal shame went down after EMDR treatments, and a significant increase in self-esteem subset scores following the treatment with EMDR. So shame goes down, the self-esteem goes up. These results supported the hypothesis, which is what they wanted, that EMDR is an effective treatment for internalized shame, which we're seeing here. Many of us that use this type of treatment actually know this. Even when shame is not the identified target of treatment, I talked about this, that it may be sometimes seen as a secondary issue when maybe we need to be working on it first. That's one of the beauties of having things like rational motive behavior therapy to look at EMDR, seeing these secondary or meta emotions, which is a concept that's very significant itself in REBT. So these preliminary findings suggest that future research is warranted to explore the efficacy of EMDR in the treatment of internalized shame. So what that's saying is we have statistical identification, statistical evidence that shows that EMDR will help with internalized shame and therefore help raise self-esteem. So another point I wanted to show you in this, in clinical settings, is what they did. Internalized shame can present itself as a chief complaint or secondary complaint. I've talked about that a little bit. Shame can also cause other symptoms, and this is important. Those of us that treat for this often see this. As when shame leads to elaborate rituals intended to keep others from seeing one's, quote, badness. So me being a bad person, I don't want other people to see that, as well as resulting from other symptoms. So an example that they give is a person with maybe a phobia of public restrooms will go to great lengths to keep secret that fear. Right? They may not attend things where a public bathroom is not individual, that it's more people. I've worked with people like this. I've actually had friends like this that had a lot of difficulty. So they will, because they have such a shame about that, they will do anything to not have to discuss that fear. So virtually all traumatized patients, so virtually all, that's significant, have some degree of internalized shame. In addition, internalized shame is often a key component in addictions, anxiety disorders, depression, major mental illness, and personality disorders. Right? Any of you that have dealt with addictions, have dealt with rituals, have dealt with things that significant depression or anxiety that you feel may have come from things that have happened in your life, many of you can probably testify that it's this shame that pushes you towards needing some relief from that. It's this shame that makes you feel like the bad person, not what happened to you. Maybe you've been able to conceptualize that you are the victim of something, but you are internalizing this shame and this guilt. So a little bit more self-esteem. Self-esteem, what we're going for, right, is the opposite of internalized shame. It represents an individual sense of personal worth that is derived more from inner thoughts and values than from praise and recognition from others. So this is our own self-esteem, not coming from the praise and recognition for others, which admittedly we like. Everybody wants to feel comfortable. Everybody wants to feel wanted in some way and successful and attractive, and whatever that means to you. It doesn't have to be the world or the the coaches, the material coaches out there kind of idea of what being a good person is or being successful is. It's the internal. So let me close up this article, this study that was done. We'll typically call an article like a peer-reviewed article. So a paired t-test, which means to me there was a certain type of information that they gathered and they used a paired t-test, which would be the correct test for this, showed a significant decrease in internalized shame subscale between the pre and post test means, right? So the mean being the average. A t-test will take the average. It'll judge individual scores off the average. If it's a paired t-test, which this one was, it will also identify the average, the means, and the scores against each other before and after, not just the average. So this is a significant kind of doing testing, this paired t-test. So a decrease in internalized shame, as well as a significant increase in self-esteem, which is what we're going for, pre and post test means. So what does a lot of this mean? And then I'll start looking at the questions that may be in there and interacting. What this means is that EMDR, we have evidence here. We never say the word prove because there could be other things that might affect it. It shows evidence that EMDR is an effective treatment for dealing with shame. Now, I see this in my office and online on a regular basis, so I understand this. I can testify to this myself. But outside of just seeing it, we also want to know, we also want to back up. We also want to identify and do studies to show that these things are not just flukes, to show that these things are appropriate standards. It's the way that we actually are able to use them in evidence-based models, which is things like insurance and certifications and licenses we want you to work on an evidence-based manner. So many of us can testify easily and proudly and identify that EMDR does help with shame. Shame is a big part of post-traumatic stress disorders, why we're talking about this, and why shame is probably one of the things I see in my office that takes people down the most notches. I work with typically very proud people, very type A individuals, a lot of military, public safety, type A individuals, people that are attracted to general channels that I might follow here on YouTube. But shame is a big kick in the nuts for us. Right? Nobody wants to feel shame. Nobody wants to feel that they're not good enough. Nobody wants to feel that it's all their fault. And sometimes things in our life are. There are a series of bad choices that have gotten us to where we are. But there's a big difference between remorse and this guilt/shame that I'm talking about. Remorse sucks. It's a negative, but it's a healthy negative emotion. Remorse is things I wish I'd done differently or not done or had done or not done, things I wish I'd done differently. And not to water anybody's down, but everybody has remorse in some way. Everybody has some kind of feelings of things they wish that had gone differently. Whereas shame and guilt is the unhealthy side of this. Shame and guilt are things like remorse, which we have, plus I'm a piece of shit because I did it or because it happened to me. And sometimes we're going to have to sit with the fact that we may have messed up. We may have to sit with the fact that we have some remorse. We may have to sit with the fact that we've screwed things up or made things worse, or we're not doing good as a father or a husband or a Christian or a worker or whatever it is that you identify with. We may have to sit with some of that. There are plenty of things I work with in my office and here online that we messed up. The person messed up. We messed up. And we might have to sit with that a little bit. And that's the remorse, but that's healthy. If I'm letting that become shame and guilt, I am now identifying my entire being as a person with that event or that series of events or the mistake that was made. And what's even wilder about shame sometimes is I will see incidences where I can identify through the story that that person had nothing to do with the trauma that happened. Now, if you're sensitive to some traumatic stories, this may be a time not to listen. And I'm not going to go into detail, but let me give you some headlines, right? If this involved sexual assault when you were young, whether by a stranger or somebody that you know, whether it involved physical assault by somebody that you trusted or a stranger, neglect, not feeling loved, feeling helpless, feeling hopeless when you're young, feeling not good enough. And maybe for you that started early in life. Maybe for you, you made it into your 20s and started making some mistakes, and now you're really beating yourself up about it later in life. But the reality is, probably anybody that watches my channel with any sense whatsoever would know that a 2 and a 5 or 7 or 8 and a 10 and a 12-year-old don't make those decisions to be traumatized. They'll typically put themselves in those positions where those bad things will happen, especially when it's by somebody that they trust. And the difficulty of those things happening to younger people, I won't go too far to this. I want to save it for maybe more talk about childhood trauma specifically instead of the shame, which is today's topic. But if something happens to you that's very bad and it's from somebody that you trust, you immediately push them away, right? That limbic system activates, the emotion gets in there, the fight or flight system kicks on, that reptile brain kicks in and it pushes them away. You got to get away from me, you're dangerous. I don't know why, I'm too young to understand this, but you're dangerous, I'll push you away. And then, as I like to say, and not necessarily in a joking manner, but when you're 7 and you push that caretaker away and you realize that you can't make macaroni and cheese by yourself, or feel love by yourself, or be tucked in at night by yourself, or get dressed by yourself, or have clothes washed by yourself, you pull this person back in. I believe it's one of the reasons that borderline personality disorder occurs and looks a lot like post-traumatic stress disorder. We push that person away, we bring them back. And how many times have you seen later in life, whether it's you or somebody that you've worked around or lived with or been in a relationship with, how wildly they will react to those two things. Get away from me, I hate you. Come back, I love you, I can't live without you. Now, maybe they're terrible at emotions and they're terrible at relationships, but maybe we're looking at shame. Don't look at me, get away. You're harming me. Maybe we're looking at guilt. Maybe we're looking at remorse. Maybe we're looking at PTSD. Maybe it's borderline personality disorder. That takes a longer discussion. But if it's shame, shame is what takes us down so many notches and will often become, as I said in the beginning of this talk, the umbrella over all of it, right? It will often become that umbrella that's going to keep us from getting to dealing with the individual traumas. And some of you may not even be thinking of individual traumas and how this might have caused shame later in your life. Maybe it's a series of events. Maybe it's just not being taken care of. Maybe it's you trusted somebody with a lot and they ruined it for you. It doesn't have to be one single event. Again, as I said in the beginning of this video, and we'll say often, single event trauma, which is really cool to treat because it works so well and so fast. People that come in and they know what's going on and what they're stuck on, 5% of what I treat. 5% of what I treat is that single event trauma. The rest of it is series of life events that have taught you to where you are. I'll start to close this portion with this and then I'll check the chat if you're here live. But one of the things that I'll regularly see is when they're dealing with this shame is often the not good enoughs, right? Often the hopeless, helpless, not good enough, which will constantly reoccur. And a lot of times I'll see that they don't even realize they're dealing with shame. They just know they're a bad person and maybe they can't identify why. Maybe they don't realize what's gone on in their life. One of the questions that I will manipulate the types of to ask the different types of this question, but if somebody feels not good enough, where did that start for you? When did you learn you weren't good enough? When did you learn that you're unlovable? When in life did you learn you can't trust people? When did you learn the world isn't safe? Some of us made it for a while before seeing that. And I think everybody gets a taste of that at some time. But if you're in your teens or 20s or 30s, then you have a better base to deal with some of that. You have a better base to deal with some of that. Here's one thing. Also, I'll start to close with and look at the chat. Is that very often, I almost could do this like a magic trick. Very often, I'll ask people, "When did you learn you weren't good enough? Weren't safe? The world wasn't safe? You were unlovable?" A vast majority, unless they have a specific trauma they're thinking of, a vast majority will stop and say 7 years old, right? Here's the magic trick. I could almost write it on my hand and show it to them before they say it. That's how often it is. And it's not that I know people's lives, but this is what I do for a living. And what you'll often find with dealing with trauma is that they'll say 7, not because it's magic, not because that's when the furthest back you can remember something, although for many people it is. 7 is when your prefrontal cortex starts forming. 7 is when you start having memory. Prefrontal cortex is the thinking part of the brain. It's not so worried about emotion, although I'm sure it takes some from it. It's all interconnected. It's the rational thinking part of the brain. Those of you that have raised kids will probably be able to identify, like I can, 7's when they start asking questions, when they start getting a little personality, when they start thinking on their own a little bit. 7 is when you start learning things. It's your prefrontal cortex. So we start putting the pieces together. It's not fully formed till age 25. So if you made it to 25 or somewhere around there before tragedy struck or before you felt unloved or unwanted, you know, then you had a much better base. The closer and closer you got to that of being able to figure this all out. What just happened to me? But at 7, you can't even make your own macaroni and cheese. And so obviously that number is going to be a magic number, although I said it wasn't magic, but a magic number that I will often hear because that's exactly when people start having those memories and start seeing that maybe they can't trust. Maybe they can't make sense of all this. So let me jump into the chat here. I'm sure I got a few friends. A lot of shalom's. Good to see you guys. Medic Mouse, always. Man, every time I see your name, I want a cigar. That's your fault. Buckets, good to see you, buddy. Appreciate that, Dano. Keep applying it. Yeah, Medic, I'm ashamed of my rituals. Hopefully cigars is one of them, since I just mentioned that before getting to that comment. But absolutely, look at the reasons we have rituals or addictions, and rituals especially. Probably the word alone isn't terrible. I probably have rituals the way that if you look at it in a non-injurious kind of way, that word, I go to the gym at a certain time of day. I like to get up early and get that done before work. I like to leave the house at a certain time. I certainly like to leave the office in the busy part of my town to get back to my home in the country by a certain part of time and not deal with traffic. I probably have some rituals. I probably eat at a certain restaurant down the street from my office too many times. It's a well-known one. I'm not going to say it, so I don't endorse it because that's bad luck. But I think I own part of the restaurant now but if the rituals are damaging or causing problems in my family or myself, then absolutely they can be bad. And obviously the shame can come from the thing that caused the rituals, and then we can have that shame of the rituals itself, of course, right? The shame, though, is getting into a place of not good enough, of embarrassed, of being a bad person, right? So maybe we need to replace the rituals. That there can always be a technical kind of way to do things, but we also need to look at the emotional side of it. That technical way to do things, I always talk about, if somebody's having trouble getting up in the morning, maybe there's some things we need to do in the day before to deal with some of those technical sides. So I think I'm buffering. Hello, internet. Oh, you can still hear me though? Well, I'll just keep talking. We'll see if the internet catches up. Maybe that video will catch up. I'm not really sure what that's all about. I don't do these lives too often. So, well, I'll keep going, and then maybe I'll add a dancing bear or myself video in it later. Um, so yeah, the ritual. If they're getting us in trouble, I don't know exactly where I got stuck at. It's hard to watch yourself gets frozen, but if the rituals are harming us, then obviously going to be a problem. Oh, there's a technical way to change things, right? If we are dealing with, um, if we're dealing with not getting up in the morning, maybe we need to change some of the things about the night before. That's a technical difference. Maybe we need to cut out caffeine or food or whatever it is we need to do. But there's also the emotional side. What is the reason that we're having? Is it anxiety that we're having trouble going to sleep and that's not getting us up in the morning? Are we waking up in the morning with deep depression and dread about the day? Um, so if we need to do that, then uh, there is a technical side, which is always good. If I need to change the rituals, if I need to add something else to it, or something to replace it that's healthier, fine. But there's always that negative side too. So, or in the emotional side that we need to work on. So, I'll just get through these real quick. It doesn't look like the camera is going to catch up for whatever reason, so that's okay. Um, let's see. Some of you learned it at 2 years old. Create major anxiety and surgery absolutely can create major anxiety. Matthew learned it at 2 year old or when you got married. Two significant times in your life where you definitely learned that maybe you can't trust people, right? Two's pretty young. If you have memories from then, that's, can be significant. I wouldn't say it's a bad thing necessarily, but most people don't remember two unless they have some significant things happen. Definitely worth looking at. Dano said, until recently, it's been life. Yeah. Spiritual attacks made it continuously easy to have that. And listen, just because I am trying to be the reformed angry Viking therapist, I'm still the angry Viking therapist. So there are plenty of times that to be very careful about the F the world attitude. Traffic will still get me at times. I was just sharing with a brother on here the other day that as a business owner, I pay a significant amount of taxes, and I'm sure many of you do as well, whether it be in your home or in your businesses. And I just saw a statistic from a acknowledged and identified CIA person that is making this public. They were just on a very popular podcast this week. That it's approximately 40 to 84 million, and probably closer to 84 million, that we're sending to Afghanistan every week on a plane. And I'm very careful with that. I don't want to sound like conspiracy theorist, but again, this is coming from a confirmed source, and that we're sending 84 million over there every week in order for humanitarian aid, which means often means we're paying the families of the people that were killed in Afghanistan. So our our soldiers here don't get that. Our families here don't get that. And I pay an awful lot of money for it to be shipped out. So I don't make this a political thing, but obviously, when I hear things like that, it's very difficult to write that check for taxes. And I don't mind paying some taxes. I like having police and fire and roads and some community involvement. But man, that makes it really tough for me. Yeah, it does look like I'm clapping. Traffic absolutely gets me the worst. So I've been on here for a little bit. I think it's approaching 30 minutes. So with it being frozen, I'm going to go ahead and probably cut this off. Yeah, PTSD sucks when you're being blown up. Absolutely. And, not only if you actually mean blown up physically, not only does the trauma from that become difficult in the mind, but you also might be dealing with TBIs or concussions, which can make some of that processing and cognitive parts even challenging. So I'll figure out what happened with the camera here. This is longest live I've done in a while, so maybe it's something that I hit. But I'm glad you're still able to hear me. Again, maybe I'll go in and throw, dancing knee in front of it or something. So that's it. I'm gonna wrap up. I appreciate you guys. If you don't mind spreading the word, I'm trying to get this channel moving a little quicker. And help more people, reach out to more. So I appreciate any help with that. I know most of the people that I see in the chat now are supporters and I consider friends, and definitely know most of your names. So I appreciate you. And we'll see how this goes. Maybe this is something I'll consider more of a tradition on a weekly or twice weekly basis. So good to hear from everybody. Please, you're more than welcome, if you haven't chatted with me before, to send me some messages, either commenting on this, and I will be sure to check it. Also, Instagram, Dr. Trevor Wilkins. So Dr. Trevor Wilkins is an easy way to get a hold of me. Or go check out theangryvikingtherapist.com to see some of the ways that I might be able to help, and you can get in contact with me. So bless all of you.